Vileborn is a tabletop RPG by Horrible Guild out of Italy. You may recall them as the creators of Wilder Feast, the quick start of which I reviewed in 2023, and which ended up being a big hit on Kickstarter. That game was a sort of warm and fuzzy Monster Hunter meets dungeon meshy cottagecore adventure engine, whereas Vileborn is really a completely different animal. This game puts you in the shoes of a so-called Vileborn, a person in the midst of a magically driven apocalypse in a gritty, gothic, fantasy, Euro-inspired world. You have dark powers that you don't really want to use, but by giving into your urges, you can recover spent powers extremely quickly, which is to say that the game really puts you in the middle of a struggle between doing good or giving into your dark urges. In this video, I'm going to go over the quick start for Vileborn in order to give you an idea of the setting and how the game works mechanically. At the time of recording, the game is crowdfunding on Kickstarter. I'll leave a link below. Actually, I did a written interview with the creator of Vileborn, Claudio Pustorino, on my newsletter. The link for that is also below. Claudio is the author of Not the End, a game that won Game of the Year at Lucca Comics and Games, and in 2024 received 6 ENnie Award nominations for Product of the Year, Best Game, Best Rules, Best Supplement, Best Layout and Design, and Best Cover Art. In the interview, I asked him about his motivations and inspirations for this game. Just like with every interview I do with RPG creators, there are some really interesting answers and lots of inspiration if you're an aspiring or active RPG creator yourself, or if you're just curious about the creative process with well-designed, high production value games. The game describes its flavor as a noble dark coming-of-age novel. This is a pretty loaded description actually, and I want to unpack the use of the term novel later in the video. But for now, we have to explore the actual setting first. Your character lives in the Aegis Empire, a sort of medieval fantasy realm that has stood for thousands of years, from what I can tell, but which has very recently fallen into darkness. For 5 years now, dark creatures like shapeshifters, vampires, ghosts, and ghouls have come out of the woodwork and started degrading and destroying civilization here. These creatures are called the Reviled. In response, the Empress of Aegis issued a decree that allows Vileborn, humans who were born with reviled magic in their blood, into the elite Order of Dusk, a secretive organization that has fought evil for centuries. But it's extremely controversial since Vileborn are widely as hated as full reviled monsters. In this game, your character is meant to be the first Vileborn enlisted into the Order of Dusk. This premise does get a bit specific for an RPG. You are specifically a Vileborn who is of age 5 years into this apocalypse, and you're always meant to be the first recruits inducted into the order, which is to say, if you finish a one-shot or a campaign of Vileborn, I think if you have a new character, you're supposed to go back in time and insert them as the first Vileborn recruits of the order again. I haven't seen or read the full core rulebook yet, so I don't know if there will be other game or campaign modalities. I do hope that they aren't suggesting that you always have to start your character as the first ever Vileborn recruits to the order. Check this out. The quick start actually suggests a 3-act structure for every adventure, which is to say you are really meant to emulate a sort of story arc every time you play. I think this particular structure is very interesting, but it would also be cool to see several more story structures to choose from. So this quick start takes on the approach of teaching you the mechanics entirely through a sample adventure composed of 7 scenes. In the interest of actually showing you the mechanics, I'm going to spoil a couple of the surprises in this adventure, but hopefully through that you can gauge the look and feel and nature of the challenges this game is trying to present to players. I'll reveal the first 4 out of the 7 scenes in this adventure, basically the first session of 2 sessions. There are 4 pre-gens you can choose from, each representing a unique dark heritage. The first is a Claw Shrouder, who has an elevated force stat and retractable fangs and claws, but whose dark urge is to hunt down and feed on human beings. The next is a Bloodsinger, who has a heightened influence stat and can better manipulate people, but is drawn to human blood. Then you have a Shadow Dancer, whose willpower stat is their highest strength and can manipulate shadows into a corporeal force, but has the urge to terrorize people. And a Ghost Walker, who is more well-rounded stat-wise and can commune with the dead, but has the urge to obey the will of unnamed spirits, which in the context of this game means doing bad things. So this sample adventure is designed to be played out in 2 sessions, divided into 7 scenes. In the first scene, your party is accompanied by a guide named Egret, who is leading you through the forest, and you're being chased by a mob of angry humans who want to kill you because you've been identified as reviled. Your party comes upon an old abandoned cabin, and your first test is to try and secure the structure to withstand the assaulting mob. So here's how the dice would work for this test. First, you choose how you would approach the problem. Let's say I'm playing as Raphael Normante, the Bloodsinger. I'd first want to choose my approach from each of the 6 core stats. These stats are actually called approaches, since they embody the way you would try to solve a problem in the fiction. They are rated by step dice, the higher the better, so an approach can be rated a D6, D8, or D10. In this case, I, as the player, might say that Raphael would want to use reason as the approach in order to fortify the cabin. That would establish my base die as a D8. The idea here would be for him to go outside of the cabin and secure the boards around the structure, which would leave him vulnerable to possible attack by the mob. With that plan in mind, I would then look to both my personality traits and any training I might have. Since exposing himself to possible attack might be considered brave, we would add a D8, but none of our training applies, so our total roll would be 2d8. You would then keep the highest roll with the hopes of exceeding a target difficulty number set by the GM. If your highest roll is above the target, then you succeed. If one or more of your highest dice equal the target, then you succeed, but the GM also comes up with a complication. And of course, if your highest die is below the target, you suffer failure on the test. One thing to note about personality and training trait words is that they are very open-ended. One is merely an adjective, and the other is either a noun or a verb, and it's a bit of an art in applying them and finding the sweet spot in allowable interpretation. One other interesting design feature is the fact that success can come in several forms that I find very permissible and generous. If you succeed a test, then you as the player can either describe the success, ask the GM to reveal useful information, or remove a condition or wound. I would hope that the GM at least requires an approach related to seeking information or curing a condition or wound, because otherwise the application of the success might be too abstract. Complications come in 3 forms. The GM can impose a condition of either anger, exhaustion, shame, fear, or insecurity on the PC, and each of these has a concrete mechanical penalty for your PC specified on your character sheet. Or a GM could give a wound as a complication, which manifests as a physical, social, or emotional trauma. These are more open-ended and do not have any mechanical penalties from what I can tell, but if your character picks up a 4th wound, they are, quote, out of play until further notice. And finally, the GM could just insert something negative or detrimental to the scene to deteriorate conditions for a player or the party. In our little scene here, your party escapes getting lynched by the mob because some other reviled show up and distract or kill them. In the next scene, you make your way to a fortress city and headquarters of the Order of Dusk, where you'll be inducted as a member. While on the road, you define your aspirations, your duty, and enrich your personality and training. Aspirations can be anything you want your PC to desire, and duty is something that the Order will want you to accomplish. Here's the most interesting part. If you can invoke your aspiration in a scene, it will instantly heal a wound if you have one, which is a very abstract way to heal if you think about it. And if you can invoke your duty in a scene, you instantly heal a condition. Think of these more like meta currencies, since you can only use them once each before needing to do something to restore them. This quick start does not describe how they're restored, but the full rulebook apparently does. This scene ends with you meeting 3 major authorities at the Order of Dusk headquarters. The Enlightened Mother, who is like the priestess of the Order and who hates Vileborn, the Imperial Envoy sent by the Empress to ensure that Vileborn are inducted and trained up quickly to be put into service, and the Grand Master, the sort of chief of the Order who is trying to keep the peace between the throne and the Order itself. Okay, darkness. Long story short here, there are times when your darkness gets triggered, like anytime a test specifically calls for it or when they interact with the reviled. Then when they roll the dice for the test, they are rolling a d12. This is the only time in the game when a d12 is used. You're trying to roll high on the d12, but no matter how high you roll, you will get a complication born of your darkness. This requires a bit of juggling for the GM because a player might roll a success or complication with their regular dice, but then trigger an extra darkness related complication on top of that. At any time, you can also just use the ability born of your dark heritage. To do so, you look at the bottom of your character sheet and determine how many marks you want to expend, 1, 2, or 3, if you even have them available. The more marks you expend, the more intense the effect, but the more difficult the underlying test becomes. You will then choose an approach and add any personality and trait bonus dice and roll on the test. The GM in this case will roll a d12 to determine how bad your darkness complication is. This may not come as a surprise to you at this point, but the complications that you end up facing are not predetermined. It's very narrative in nature and up to the discretion of the GM. You'll also notice these gifts at the bottom of your sheet. These never require a test. You can just invoke them at any time, and they each have one positive and one negative effect, but they will need to be restored before you can use them again. And finally, there are your urges. The only way to clear all of the heritage and gift boxes and thereby enable your character to use them again is to give in to your urge. It is in this way that the player is tempted to ever invoke their urge in order to refresh these ability slots. At the start of the next scene, it turns out that your guide, Ygritte, is a Vileborn and you have to fight her. This is what, for lack of a better term, a stat block looks like in this game, and it's very well done in my opinion. The PCs will need to score 5 successes with any approach in order to defeat Ygritte, but when they score their 3rd success, Ygritte will transform into her dark heritage form, a monstrous panther creature. These are suggested complications for the GM to use, as well as 3 levels of darkness related complications. Since the combat mechanics are quite a bit more narrative in nature than normal, there's mercifully some guidance on how to run the encounter. A couple of the most notable points to me were to never invalidate previous successes and to build on complications, and to feel free to invent new difficulties and complications not listed in the enemy's stat block. Now this is way easier said than done for a brand new GM, of course. As simple as the rules are, they do require some hefty creativity and improv skills. One very big feature of this game is that essentially there are no deaths unless everyone agrees. The idea, I think, is that the game is setting out to tell a story rather than simulate combat and death at any cost. It's just a story-first style of play that some people enjoy. Also, remember that this game identifies its flavor as a coming-of-age novel, and most novels see their characters surviving for most or all of the story, or if they do die, it's narratively significant. In the next scene, after you've either beaten or been beaten by Ygritte, but not died, of course, you will be handed a pipe to smoke. In this pipe is a substance called reverie, and it's derived from the blood of a reviled, amongst other things. It can be smoked, ingested, drunk, or injected, and it has the instant effect of clearing all of your dark ability and gift marks. It's the ultimate health pack, but the Quickstarter does not reveal what side effects it might have on your character, if any. Leveling up in this game comes in the form of adding a word to your training and or your personality. So the full game will include 3 more dark heritages for a total of 7, tools to create original stories, scenarios, and characters, mechanics for assisting each other and for PvP, affinity and rival mechanics, and enemies in the categories of vampires, shapeshifters, fallen, which are like restless souls and ghostly entities, fae, and shadows, which are the embodiment of negative and destructive feelings and emotions. All right, here are my thoughts on the Vileborn Quickstart. I'll give you my cons, then my pros, and then my wish list. Cons. Experienced GM required. I think the irony with story-first mechanically soft games like this is that even when there is very little crunch, it takes a GM with at least some experience to run it. Just imagine a brand new GM trying to juggling the ambiguity of 2 different kinds of narrative complications on a single dice roll, or trying to interpret personality and trait keywords with a test. These softer parts might be a lot more intuitive for a GM who has run a number of games of any kind already. Definition of success. I'm a little worried about how a success is defined in the Quick Start, and hope that it's at least a little more restrictive than described. We see success described here as where the player can accomplish the thing that their character was trying to do, elicit valuable information, or, with some prior intent, heal a wound or condition. I would hope that the reward would be more tied to the approach and the action being taken by the PC. Pros. Let's just tell a story. Like I mentioned earlier, story-forward games like this are trying to make sure that a collaborative story is being told more than it's trying to simulate the harsh and gritty consequences of failed combat roles. One approach is not better than the other, and it's more of a spectrum than a binary choice at any rate. I just appreciate that all parts of this game's design are faithful to the story-first approach. And ultimately, the mechanics really allow the GM and players to be very creative and improvisational in ways that a crunchier RPG would not allow. Artwork and presentation. The artwork is pretty amazing and very consistent thus far. It evokes the feel of a primo graphic novel. I met one of the guys from Horrible Guild at Gen Con, Davida Amici, who shares my first name, but a much fancier version of it. And I joked with him that the guy on the cover of Vileborn looks a lot like Timothée Chalamet. I don't know if this was intentional or not, but the cover, like all the internal artwork, is pretty top-notch and evocative of this cool, dark world that the game is trying to evoke. Mechanics direct player choices. I think compared with open-ended RPGs that have the everything but the kitchen sink settings and tons of rules for every possible action you can think of, games like Vileborn have the advantage of focus in their mechanics. What the game is trying to emulate is a coming-of-age story arc where your character is grappling with dark powers and urges. And how does it actually get you as the player to do that? Simple. It makes it to where if you want to use your dark powers, you have to keep giving into your dark urges, which will cause you problems in the long run if the GM knows what they're doing. Wishlist. I did have a few things that I wished to see in the final full game. Here they are. A full timeline of the Aegis Empire and the Order of Dusk. I think as evocative and cool as the artwork is, I still really need a chapter on the setting itself. That would really help in order to really imagine the immensity of the violation of allowing Vileborn into the Order and the context of the Order in society. Sources of darkness. The darkness descended upon the Empire 5 years ago, and it's not clear where it all came from. I'd love to see a comprehensive explanation of the possible sources of the darkness. Really, the best case scenario would be a series of rollable tables where you can generate a unique source of darkness that enables GMs to continually surprise players who are going to be playing this game for more than one campaign. Multiple story arc structures. The quick start suggests that the game will always be played in a particular 3-act structure. This structure is fine, but it would be cool to also have alternatives to this story arc format, or maybe even some guidance on how to run this game in a more traditional sandbox mode. GM support. As I mentioned earlier, this game might be a heavy lift for new GMs, so some comprehensive guidance could go a long way for inexperienced tables. For example, a big list of possible complications and darkness complications that GMs can peruse, divided by situation, and lists of suggested personality and trait words for players to browse. So that's it for the Vileborn Quick Start. I've left links below to where you can check out the crowdfunding page as well as read my interview with the game's designer, Claudio Pustorino. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Vileborn so far and what you think about this heavy of an approach to story-first game design. Thanks as always for watching. See ya!